Today is Tuesday, August 10th. This is the oral history of Captain Beverly G. Kelley, K-E-L-L-E-Y. She's the Deputy Director of International Affairs at the United States Coast Guard. She's a fixture in the Coast Guard community and has the distinction of being the first woman to command a U.S. military combatant vessel, the Cape New Wagon, on April 12, 1979. My name is Kate Scott, and I'm conducting this interview for the oral history program of the Women's Memorial. So thank you for being here. Let's start with an introduction and tell me where you are right now in terms of your position as Deputy Director.
I'm Beverly Kelley, Captain of the Coast Guard, and I am the Deputy Director of International Affairs. And pretty much what we do is the Coast Guard is very active internationally. People wouldn't understand that, but what we do is we do a lot of training and technical assistance in the arena of security assistance for countries all around the world. We have unique mission capabilities that are useful to most navies around the world. Most navies are the size and have missions similar to our U.S. Coast Guard. So they oftentimes call on us for assistance in how to create their Coast Guards and how to build up their capability in as far as their vessels, their aircraft, and their training in the technical arena. So my staff does a lot of work around the world. I'm talking about pretty much every continent right now.
And how big is your staff?
Very small. I have 35 in the staff, but we do have a training division that does training around the world of about 50 people stationed down in Virginia. And so they are uniquely qualified to do training in the international arena.
Okay. And when did you take the position, and how has the war on terror affected what you do on a daily basis?
Well, I took a position when I got off my last cutter in 2002, summer of 2002, and I worked for a senior executive service member who's the Director of International Affairs and Foreign Policy Advisor to the Commandant. And as far as the war on terror, the demand for our capabilities has really increased considerably. Terrorism, and counterterrorism, that affects the whole world right now. And our capabilities, what we've learned since 9/11, it has been useful. We had a steep learning curve. It's not that we've done port security all of our life. It's part of our mission, but it had not been the focus until after 9/11. And now there's a greater focus on port security issues and port safety and security issues. And what happened is the countries around the world look to the United States for assistance in making their ports secure and safe. So we've had a great demand on that particular area of our capability. So once we got ourselves back up to speed and actually more active in that arena, we've had the request from the international to do the same. So that's just an example of how terrorism has affected our workload in particular.
Okay, well, let's go back to the beginning now. First, could you tell me when and where you were born, and maybe a little bit about your upbringing, your parents, what their names were, and what they did for a living, and what led you into the Coast Guard?
I was born in Shawnee, Oklahoma. However, I moved to Florida, Miami, Florida, at a very young age. My mother is the primary caregiver for me, and she was was a registered nurse and had odd jobs while the children were putting us through school. So she pretty much carried the load. Different fathers along the way, but she's really the strong person in my life was my mother. And I grew up in South Florida, and then I went to the University of Miami and graduated down South Florida. Graduated from there with a math degree, and I then went off for about a year to figure out what I wanted to do. And I ended up coming back after 1 year and joined the Coast Guard.
Why
at that time.
Coast Guard and not another branch?
Well, kind of an interesting story. I was kind of flailing with what I wanted to do in my life. I worked in banking primarily because that was a summer job And when I came back after my year off, once you've been gone a year, all your college loans are due.
Yeah.
So I came back and had to get a regular job after I traveled around the country on my own. And I ended up working in a bank and was trying to get a manager trainee position, being a college graduate, and was unable to get one. I had to start at the bottom after having lots of banking experience. So I was irritated, and right across the street from the Coast Guard, from the bank, was the Coast Guard recruiting office, which was, I considered, divine intervention. And actually, I didn't even look at it until my mom was traveling and sent me a newspaper article that they were taking women in the Coast Guard. And the day I was living with my grandmother, and the day I returned from work after being real frustrated in the bank, my grandmother pointed to the article in the paper, and I opened up a letter from my mother, and the same article was there about the Coast Guard. So I felt there was some need, and the Coast Guard was located right across the street from where I was working. So everything sort of fell in line, and I went in the Coast Guard, and they said, well, we have a 6-month waiting list to join, and I was frustrated in the bank, and I got angry and said, I have a college degree, and I just can't find a decent job. And they went, oh, you have a college degree, you could be an officer. And I was like, well, what does that mean? Well, you can have a job in 2 months instead of 6 months. And I said, okay, and they you make more money. So I said, okay, I'll become an officer. So right then I did all the tests, and at my lunch break from the bank, I did some information on the physical, and I thought about it, and one day, I was 9 days into working at the bank, and a guy came through as a manager trainee, and I was very upset, and I thought maybe this was the first time I had been discriminated against, and I really confronted him, and he said he had a business degree, and I said, I have a math degree, and he said, well, my father's a personal friend of the president of the board of directors or something. So that did it. I quit. I walked downstairs, went across the street, and I signed to join the Coast Guard. So I made that move, and a month and a half later, I was on my way to officer candidate school. And I joined for 3 years. And it was an original contract. And then when I started getting into sea duty, I really enjoyed it, and now 28 and a half years later, here I am.
Let me go back and just clear up a few questions. First of all, what was your mother's name?
My mother's name was Lois McClear. They called her Penny.
What was she like as a person, or what is she like?
She's a very strong woman, obviously a strong figure in my life. She raised the children, 3 children, just waiting tables off and on, and as a bookkeeper. And she had started nurses training when she was not married, and in those days, back in the, I guess it was the 40s, they didn't allow nurses to be married and go to nurses training. They had to live in dormitories. So she quit nurses training to get married, and raised a family, and then at age 53, when we were all off on our own, she went back to school and completed her nurses training, got her RN, and we were all very proud of her. And she served as a nurse for several years, and she only recently died about a year ago, just a couple months before my son was born, and suddenly died. But I'll always remember the influence she had on me. She and my grandmother were the trailblazers. My grandmother was president of Business and Professional Women in 1930, and had been a real trailblazer on her own, and raised my mother by herself too. So I've been fortunate to have very strong women figures in my personal life.
What about religious traditions? Did you affiliate with a particular religion?
Protestant religions, primarily Methodist. I grew up. My mother was Presbyterian. But currently, my husband is Catholic, so I've been going to Catholic services.
And what year did you graduate from high school?
1970.
1970. And what high school was it?
Miami Carroll City High School in Northgate County.
And when you graduated from high school, you majored in, well, you were good in math. And
I guess I ended up in math because I liked it in college. I didn't really have any ideas of what I would do when I went to college. So I went to 3 different colleges, but I ended up graduating from the University of Miami.
And in 76, that's the first class they allowed women into the academies as well. So you're kind of in an important time. You were commissioned in '76 from Officer Candidate School, but can you tell me a little bit about what that experience was like, being one of the first women?
Right, they took women, started taking women regularly in the Coast Guard, and I think all the services in 1973, as far as going to Officer Candidate School and becoming commissioned officers. And I went in 1976, so the Coast Guard ran OCS classes 2 a year. So I was in there in one of the first classes, but not the first. And
how many women were in your class?
There were 9 women in my class. There are currently just 2 left. And my friend, my classmate, is an admiral in the Coast Guard, Jody Breckenridge, and I'm very proud of her. And then myself were the only 2 left out of the 9. The 9 out of 60 graduated. So it was not a bad. It was a pretty good percentage. Yes.
Yeah. At that time, promotion for women's officers was relatively limited and were banned from ground combat as well as most ship and aircraft positions. So what jobs were open to you at the time of your graduation?
Well, to me, the Coast Guard has been pretty much on the cutting edge of offering opportunities for women. I did not have sea duty opportunities, though, and they did not put women on ships. And we did have women in aviation, though, and we were allowed to go into aviation for us. Our cutters and our aircraft are combatant. The cutters are considered combatant at a certain size and over, because the Navy, in time of war, the Coast Guard Commandant reports to the Chief of Naval Operations, along with the resources to do the mission, whatever war we have. If we had like a world war that came in again, that's what exactly would happen. So we still train. We have the military readiness duties to be able to make that transition if necessary. And so those opportunities were out there, but we did not actually go on ships because the Navy, we would actually change operational control of the Navy. So there was always a worry that we wouldn't be able to go with the ships. And that, in case, was the worry for a long, long time, even after we got on the ships. But every other opportunity, every other position in the Coast Guard was open to women at the time.
Okay. And so tell me about your first assignment. Did you feel adequately prepared for that?
Well, I worked in oil pollution, marine environmental protection area. And at that time in the Coast Guard, there were different angles. There were, in the marine safety field, there was environmental protection, and there was marine inspection, where you got to actually go inspect the ships and certify them and certify their crews. And I went into the environmental protection side, and then my next step was going to be the inspection side. And I was anxious to do that so I could actually get on the ships. Even though I wasn't stationed on one, I could go through commercial ships and be around that environment, which I enjoyed. So I worked in marine environmental protection. I liked that in particular because I felt I had an impact as an ensign in the Coast Guard. Even though I was an ensign, the Coast Guard gives their officers and enlisted members opportunities, real strong opportunities, and positions that are important. And that, for example, as an ensign, I would go out with the enlisted folks that were trained in investigating oil spills and survey the oil spills and try to figure out and analyze where the spills came from. And then I would write up the reports, and on these reports would be signed by the captain of the port, and they would actually go to the companies and they would actually be fined for spilling the oil. And I felt pretty good about that because in college I used to go to protests against the environment, and here I was able to actually do something about it. So I felt real good about it. And the Coast Guard does give us a lot of responsibility in those areas. Obviously, more senior people were signing the reports and reviewing them and sending them on. But at that time, I felt like I personally was having an influence on a fine to Exxon for $25,000. You know. Later, I realized that oftentimes they're negotiated down to warnings, and you know, they are negotiated down because we do try to work with industry, not against industry. However, you know, it was still important what I was doing, and a lot of changes were made, you know, to accommodate and to stop the spillage of oil. So I did that for a year, and then I had the opportunity to go to sea during that period, and I took it.
Yeah. And now should we go over that again? Did you get that first part recorded? story. Would you mind
Nope.
telling that story again about 1977, or, well, it was 76? 77, you reported aboard the first Coast Guard cutter to have women permanently
Oh, and how
assigned. Maybe you could talk a little bit about the timing behind that and what you said earlier, just for the record.
Oh, okay. I always wanted to go to sea, so I wrote to the Marine Safety Office where I worked in oil pollution. I wrote a letter to the Coast Guard Commandant as to why they should put women on ships. And I sent it through my chain of command, which was appropriate through the Marine Safety Office with the captain of the port. And he took a look at it, and in it I had talked about how this is probably the first time I've ever been prevented from doing anything because I was a woman. And I was irritated. I wanted to go to sea. And I knew my time was going by. And you don't really go on a ship the first time at a more senior level because you're at a point where you're training junior officers.
Yeah.
So I was a junior officer and my time was going by as a junior officer, so I was afraid I would lose the opportunity if it ever came up. So I wrote this letter, and the captain of the port, the boss at the time, my captain, said this would never fly because it's way too controversial, and what you need to do as opposed to providing them an issue is to provide them the problem and the solution and give them ideas of how they could actually put women on ships. So in that letter I rewrote it and explained how they could immediately put women on ships, because one of the main concerns was the berthing situation, the sleeping arrangements. And a lot of the older ships were designed with large berthing areas, so a lot of people in one berthing area. So that was a concern to have men and women in the same berthing area. But on our larger cutters at the time, our newer cutters, there were accommodations that they could actually put women on board. The officers had their own berthing areas. They had one or two people per room, and they may have shared a head with the men, but you can always lock the door. So that was immediately existed that we could go on them. In addition, the enlisted women, there were 12-person berthing areas on those ships, so we could put 12 women enlisted on the ships. So I wrote up how that could be done, and I recommended it, and I said, oh, by the way, when you open it up, I would like to be the first one to go. And so I submitted that letter in. Submitted it in late November, of 1976, not long after I had been commissioned. And I waited and waited, and in January, I got my reply back, and I thought that was an exorbitant amount of time, but working in headquarters now, I understand why that was actually a very fast response to such a large issue. But they denied me. They said, our policy is you will not go to sea. Women do not go to sea. And we just appreciate your interest, but you have a great career you can do in oil pollution and marine safety. So I was disappointed, to say the least. However, that year, President Carter was president, and he was interested in increasing women's opportunities. So he spread the word, apparently, to his cabinet. And the Coast Guard at that time fell under the Department of Transportation as opposed to the Department of Defense. So our secretary was Secretary Adams, Brock Adams. He took that to heart, what the president said, and said, I have a military service, the Coast Guard, that works for me, so I'm going to tell them that I would, he told the Coast Guard that he would like us to find a way to make that happen. So the Commandant saluted and said, aye, aye, sir, and my mom swears they pulled out my old letter and looked at what I had recommended, and in June of that same year, they had denied me going in January. In June, I had orders to cutter Morgenthau, which was 378, the high endurance cutter that had that arrangement of berthing.
So the Morgenthau was the first one.
Yes.
And tell me a little bit about the composition of the crew, and maybe a little bit about what the goal of the Morgenthau was.
The Morgenthau is like all of our Coast Guard cutters, a multi-mission platform that performs all Coast Guard missions in pollution response, search and rescue, maritime law enforcement, and military readiness. And so we do all those kinds of missions, and the Morgenthau was a ship that did all of that. It's a 378-foot high endurance cutter with a crew of, at that time, probably about 140. The last one I got off of, we were up to about 170 in the crew. But the crew makeup at the time, we ended up with 2 women officers and 12 enlisted women of that complement. The officers, I had 18 officers on my cutter, so we were 2 of us out of the 18. And we went on board. There was an interesting catch to that, is that in time of war, the Coast Guard reported to the Chief of Naval Operations, or our resources could go work for the Navy. And so the controversy was having women on Coast Guard vessels working Navy missions. We would change operational control to the Navy. So I was unable to report onto the cutter until September, even though I had orders in June, because the Morgenthau was changing home ports from New York to San Francisco, and they were going to come around, stop in San Diego, and go to refresher training, which is a Navy-run training for military readiness. So the Navy would not allow women on the ships to do the training. So I could not report aboard until they had completed that training, and they reported into their home port in San Francisco. So, but since then, a lot has happened since then, and now we do not change operational control to the Navy. We did not up to 1996. We just stayed under the Coast Guard's operational control to avoid this issue of women on the ships. In 1996, though, the Navy opened up all combatant vessels to, not all except submarines. They opened up all of their vessels to their women. So we didn't worry about it after that.
Isn't the Navy policy also based primarily on birthing?
It is. It's they say it's based on that. I don't think they. I think they still hold back on one or two of the predominantly male things, and for the Navy, it's submarines. And I think they're hanging on to an antiquated issue. And I think it's a policy issue right now that they don't put women on subs. Mind you, the sub birthing situation, I don't know how it is on their larger subs. On their older subs, it was tough, but they have not made any attempts in the building of their newer subs to accommodate women either. And I think it's just an old idea that will die away, and eventually they will open all their ships to women. And interesting is there are males that really want that to happen. I sat on a panel at the Naval Academy that talks about, it is called the Corbin panel, I think it's Corbin. Anyhow, they talk about women's issues. And sitting next to me was a Navy nuclear sub commander, a guy in charge of a nuclear sub. He was more irritated than I was that women were not allowed on submarines. Because that year that I sat on that panel, the top 1 or 2 graduates of the Naval Academy were women, and he was unable to tap them to come to his ship. And traditionally, nuclear subs were getting the top of the class. He was not able to tap them because of this policy. So he was more irritated than anything. He took pride, and the submarine fleet takes pride in getting the top of the top. And he was unable to do that. So he was a great advocate for opening subs for women.
I hope we see it happen soon.
I hope we do too. And it really, every time I hear as to why they don't do it, they were the same excuses they used that prevented me from going to sea. And they're the same excuses they use for everything, you know. Bottom line, it's just a culture. And that's one of the toughest cultures to tap into. Us moving on to ships was a big cultural change.
Did you face any particular challenges? Do you recall any sort of hardship or discomfort?
Yes.
Can you give me some examples?
Probably the first one was the dealing with the Navy. Because on the combat ships I go on, we have to deal with the Navy. And my fear of being yanked off my ship, the idea was that if we ever did change control or the Navy take our ships, they were going to take our women off and put men on board. And there were men designated in our shore unit and at basically our command centers and throughout the Coast Guard for each billet of the women so that they would immediately replace us if we went to war. I hated that hanging over my mind all the time and hanging over my head. So I was real resentful to the Navy about that, and And I really pushed our leadership to say, you know, they can't be doing this. It takes away cohesiveness. And I commanded some of these ships. And there was a man designated to relieve me of my command if we went to the Navy. So I'm probably the happiest person when they changed their policy of women non-combatants. So I no longer had to report my position, you know, who I was and the positions of all the women on the ships. We used to have to report that every month. And there were designated men to replace us. So that was a tough one, trying to deal with the Navy in that respect. And it also irritated the crew. It took away crew cohesiveness. I didn't fight it too much because I was afraid that would set us back of going at all on the ships. So, but after the fact, I'm real happy that's changed. The big thing that did, too, it affected my initial reporting onto my first ship. And what that did, as far as my capabilities, it set me back a little bit with my peers. The first ship, when they went to refresher training, that is where you really learn your military readiness. You learn your capabilities. You work as a team to save the ship, you know, for some real extensive training that you do with the Navy. I miss that, and we worry about that because that was a period of time where I used to say where we got beat on by the Navy, which was good for all good reasons, to prepare us and make us militarily and structurally ready as a team to save our ship in time of war or in time of peace if we had some kind of a disaster, you know, collision or a grounding or something. Or fires and flooding. They do a lot of training in that area to save your ship. And navigation-wise, they grill you on all of your skills. I didn't get to experience that. Besides the fact that we all dread that on ships, going to that training, I missed out on some of the camaraderie. So there was some resentment immediately when we got on board that we could come on board and we didn't have to suffer like they did. There was resentment on my part because I missed a great trip coming around through the Panama Canal, you know, getting my golden shellback certificate, all of the things that you do, traditions on board ship. I missed all of those fun things because I wasn't considered as salty as the men. And when we first got on board, they resented us greatly for not going through that training. That aside, when I went to the first time I was able to go through that training is when the Coast Guard finally said, we don't need to change operational control of the Navy. We'll keep them under Coast Guard control and still send them to refresher training. I went the first time ever as a lieutenant, as the operations officer, feeling very, very nervous, with a lot of anxiety, having heard horror stories about going through this training, and I never got to experience it as a junior officer. Now I'm thrust into a rather senior position as a department head, as a navigator, to safely get the ship, you know, through navigation drills and things like that, having never gone through it before. So I was not as prepared. I had to work a lot of extra time to get myself prepared, both in my capabilities and my experience level, and also my anxiety. I had to get through it as an emotional problem and a professional problem. So that was a problem, and I resented the Navy for that for a long time.
Was there any sort of blatant offenses brought towards you by the crew?
Not by the crew. I think I have a great tolerance for those kinds of things, probably more tolerance than most. And I was very nervous that I would be taken off the ship for some reason. So some of the blatant ones I think I let slide because it was more important for me to be able to stay on the ship. And I wasn't as mature to deal with it. But the Coast Guard was very good about it. They saluted and said, we will make this work. The issues that were more difficult, besides those professional ones with the Navy, were dealing with the press. We had to face a lot of press because it was a novelty, and that was difficult. And that too caused resentment. You know,
you were getting the spotlight.
But the press situation really, how you felt about it was where you were coming from. For example, my first ship, I was on the Morgenthau. We made long patrols, 3-month patrols in Alaska. We would have port calls about once every 3 to 4 weeks. Well, the first thing we do when we pull into port is the women all had to stay back and couldn't go on liberty because the press was going to be there and they wanted to interview us. So we resented that we couldn't go on liberty. And then the men resented it because they felt we were getting some special attention. So it depended on where you sat, whether the press was a good deal or not. So I learned a lot about dealing with the press, dealing with the men with the press. When I had my first command, I got a lot of attention. It was embarrassing, and it made it difficult to also do your job and get the press attention, but I learned how to deal with the press. To avoid resentment among the crew, I would make sure I made friends with one of the newspaper reporters in Hawaii, in Maui, and I said, I will call you whenever we have great search and rescue cases come through, and you come to interview about it, and you can come interview me as long as you interview one of my crew members and put something in the paper about one of my crew members. And I found that the whole article could be about me, but if there was one statement in there from Seaman Jones or something, he was so proud of that, and the crew was so thrilled about it, he would send that home to his mom, that they welcomed the press come in, no matter what the interview was about, as long as they talked about one of my crew members. And so that ended up a good way to deal with the press.
And that was in '79 you went to command the Cape New Wagon.
Yes.
And what, let's see, you said this is different than the 3-month patrols in Alaska, obviously.
Right.
Tell me a little bit about the mission of that ship and what you did on it, how long you were on it, and what it was like.
I was on the Morgenthau and I got command of my first cutter. It's a 95-foot patrol boat.
Okay.
Not unlike the men, my counterparts, my peers, this is when the Coast Guard gave you at the time your first opportunity to command a cutter. It's a small patrol boat, but it was considered a combatant, and it had a crew of. I had a crew of 15. Most of them were 12, but mine was larger because I was an isolated station in Maui, Hawaii, and we had some additional responsibilities, so I was given a few extra folks. I was the only officer, as in all of them. I had a chief petty officer who was my executive petty officer. He was quartermaster chief. And the crew was all men, except for myself. And I happened to have been in timing. I went on the first ship to have women, as I described earlier, and then I ended up being the first woman to have command. And not unlike my peers, this is the opportunity they give us as a junior officer. They have a nice, strong chief petty officer who helps you through the whole process as your XO. And his name was Chief D'Elia, Joe D'Elia, and he's a retired Master Chief right now. And we stay in touch periodically. He was a great help to me, to help me get through it. And I was the first to have command of that. At the same time I had command in Maui, Hawaii, they also put another Lieutenant JG in command of the exact same type of class of ship over in Miami, Florida, and her name was Susan Moritz. And she and I are very good friends. She's a retired commander right now in the Coast Guard, retired. And our mission off of Maui was primarily search and rescue and law enforcement. We did a lot of rescue cases off of there. I also had a 21-foot Boston whaler attached to my unit that did close-in search and rescue. So we had a little station at the time. We have since decommissioned that boat, and it is a small boat station there in Maui now, as opposed to the 95-footer. The 95-footers were decommissioned, and the 82-footers, the patrol boats, were decommissioned over the last, well, the 82s recently, and the 95s several years ago. And what replaced them were the 110-foot patrol boats, which we have 6 of them serving over in the Gulf.
Oh, really?
So you see, they are combatants. Yes, 6. And they were over there during the war. And that's one of the interviewees I'd like you to talk to is Holly Harrison, who commanded one of those 110s in the Iraq War, the most recent Iraq War.
Okay. We'll come back to the Iraq prep. You were involved in several. Was it several ships?
No, just the one prep, like some of the preps for the ship.
Let's talk about, reflecting on, you were on several ships, and just so we don't run out of time, maybe could you talk to me a little bit about one of your most memorable search and rescue missions, or is there one that just really you're never going to forget?
Right. There were several, but probably the most recent one was on the 378, the Boutwell. I had command of, and out of San Francisco, and we had an Alaska patrol, and hit the worst weather I've seen in my 14 years of sea time was in the Bering Sea, and that was we we had watched the weather up in Alaska. We watched the weather very closely, and we had I had nestled down in the Aleutian Islands, pretty much steaming back and forth between two islands to wait out two big storms that were coming through in April. This was April of 2001. And so we were down there just waiting it out, and it was a series of two storms coming through. We picked up UMIB, which is an Urgent Marine Information Broadcast of an EPIRB, which is Emergency Positioning Indicating Radio Beacon, which is someone puts this electronic gadget over into the water, which sends out a signal that is picked up on the radios that says they're in distress. And they activate automatically if they get wet. So this EPIRB was picked up, and it was located due north of us in the Bering Sea, and which set us right in the path of these two storms. It was a fishing vessel with 15 people on board that was missing, that had probably gone down out of some catastrophic situation. So we headed up north toward the case, right in the midst, or heading into where the storm was going to hit. The storms were going to hit. We got hit with the first wave of storms on our way up, and we only had about 20-foot seas then, but they were right on our beam. So we were working to get up there as fast as we could without staying totally in the trough, which is where you stay when the seas are hitting you broadside. We got up there with relatively little damage. I had a seaman got hurt, and we ended up flying him off. And we started searching. And it was very tough because we found bits and pieces of the ship, and we never did find any of the people. They lost all 15. Then we found an immersion suit bag that had the name of the ship on it, life ring with the name of the ship. So it was real hard losing that ship. And I had a lot of real strong crew members that stood out extra lookouts to try to find them, and we could not find them. But then by the time they suspended the search with no hope of finding them, we were in the path of this storm, the worst storm I had ever seen. In Alaska, they're just routine. They pretty much call them hurricanes and typhoons everywhere else. So we ended up steaming into it because that was the safest thing to do. And I measured the sea based on the height of eye on the top of the bridge to be 60 feet, 60-foot sea, which is huge, and about 80 to 90 knot winds. Now, we got through it fine, which was a miracle. The ship was a sturdy old ship built in '68, but still old. And but when we lost our own life raft in the process, we took a big roll, and the life raft went over the side. A 25-man life raft that inflated at the time. So ironically, we look back and there's the orange life raft, and my first reaction was, how could it be? And I was excited a minute, thinking, I got people on this life raft, and then I went, oh, it was mine. So consequently, I had to console the crew that, not unlike the Titanic, we had plenty of life rafts, and the engineers or steerage was not going to be left behind, you know.
Oh, wow.
So anyhow, that deployed and went off. Didn't turn around to get it. That was way too dangerous to turn around. And we got through the storm, which was really bad. The weather caved in our mount for our gun, the nets up into our gun, our bow gun. But we lived into Dutch Harbor, and I say that's my most memorable one is because of the reaction of the people in Dutch Harbor. The Coast Guard has missions to enforce fisheries laws, which was why I was up there. So we're hard on the fishermen because fishing is the most dangerous occupation in the United States. So it is very dangerous, so we enforce laws very stringent with them. But when we arrived in that port, we were welcomed with open arms by the fishing fleet there because the ship was out of that port. And my crew could not buy a beer in the town that night because we had tried to save these people. And they sent us wonderful letters. We got letters from the survivors' families, or not survivors, the people who died, their families. And some of them sent these terrific letters and emails describing, putting faces on the people that we lost and thanking us so much for what we did. Luckily, the seaman I had who got injured during the storm, who we had flown off, he had been cut very badly above the eye, and it was too rough for my corpsman to sew him up, so we flew him ashore. He ended up getting stitches in fine. It was a very delicate operation to stitch him up, and he flew back on board the cutter at the very end of the patrol, which made me feel great. But although we lost all the people, it really hurt the crew because they wanted, obviously we're lifesavers and we want to save them. We did learn a lot from that, and it meant a lot to me, the reaction of the fishermen, the community, and the public. So that was one of my best SAR cases ever.
Yeah. Let's, while we're on this, it sounds like leadership is really a critical point in situations like that, and I just wondered maybe you could speak to your philosophy on leadership and how you maintain a, not even just beyond structurally and tactically, I mean, how do you maintain morale as a leader? How do you inspire people? It's kind of a tough question.
Right.
But
I think the first thing you do is you have to understand and truly believe that every individual has something to offer and is part of the success of the ship. That's when and you always keep that in mind as a leader, and that's how you live and how you do your missions. That's how you thank the crew, and that's how when things are messed up, you take responsibility for it because you have misled them. And when they're successful, you give all of them the credit for it, and yourself too, because you get credit for it. But I think you give your credit to the crew because they're the ones that keep you out of danger. And in our case, in the Coast Guard, we give responsibility at a very junior level. We believe in our folks. It's a small service, and they rise to the occasion. They are as proud, no matter if they're straight out of boot camp or if they've been in 30 years as a captain. They're as proud and dedicated to the mission as you are. And if you realize that and give them due credit, they come through for you. And that's my main philosophy on leadership.
That's a good answer. So let's talk a little bit about some of your other. This was the Bering Sea. That was on the
Boutwell.
On the Boutwell. Well, before the Boutwell, there was the Venturus and the Laguerre and Northland. Maybe you could talk a little bit about those 3 ship assignments, and then we can move on to some other questions.
All right. The Venturus was a 210-foot medium endurance cutter. I was the operations officer on. I think that was probably my favorite ship as far as my job goes. Being operations officer was very enjoyable. It even beat being CO as far as I was concerned because you're actually in the middle of all the action. I was a boarding officer. I used to go out and on small boats at night and jump on boats and do boardings. And
what do you mean by that?
Well, we board. We have jurisdiction over any U.S. vessel anywhere except in the territorial sea of another country. So all Americans and U.S. vessels have to comply with our requirements as far as our safety requirements and our licensing and all of our requirements. So we board a lot of boats out at sea, and that's one of our main missions. The only way you can get on board to be sure they're in compliance with all applicable federal laws is to get on board and do boardings. And so we do a lot of boardings. And that's also where if you're on board and checking certain safety requirements or ensuring they're in compliance with the law, you may also then find contraband or any kind of illegal activity that's going on. So I enjoyed being an operations officer because I was able to actually do all the boardings. I do a lot of the boardings. I was able to coordinate all the operations the ship did. We deploy with helicopters, so I was able to plan the helicopter flights and where we would go and what port calls we would make. And so I had the ability to actually do the fun mission, do all the missions myself, and towing boats, and I enjoyed that very much. When you're a commanding officer, you do all those things too, but like I said, you rely on the subordinates to actually physically go on the boats, and you stay back on the ship and make the judgment calls and make sure the bosses are informed, and and make sure that safety, everybody's considering safety while you're at it. So I enjoyed that ops job very much. I was the only woman on that ship too.
Really?
Yes, that's a crew of about 50 to 60. And
you were the only woman?
Yes. I was on Cape Newwagon in that one. And then I went on Cutter Laguerre. I was the executive officer, pre-commissioned that ship. It's a brand new cutter. That was another experience I had of learning how to, bring a ship online. I was on there 3 years as executive officer. Executive officer, second in command, and that was my first EXO tour, and I enjoyed that. We pre-commissioned it for a year, and then we made it operational for 2 years.
Wow.
And we primarily did Caribbean patrols. We did one North Atlantic patrol. It was out of Portsmouth, Virginia, and then we did Caribbean patrols, and that was a counter-drug mission, and I enjoyed that. I got to do boardings a little bit in the beginning with one of my COs, and the other one came on and said, no, the executive officer doesn't do boardings. So I wasn't I had to move up out of the boarding arena. But bringing a ship online, that's a crew of 100 on that cutter. That's a medium endurance cutter, 270 feet long.
So it's a little bit bigger.
Yes.
And then you went on to the Northland, and you became commanding officer. How was the Northland different from Cape Newhaven?
Well, Northland was the same class as Laguerre. It was a 270-foot medium endurance cutter, 1,000 ton ship, and with a crew of 100. So I ended up commanding that one, and that also was out of Portsmouth. And that was primarily the Caribbean mission. Haitian immigration, we brought a lot of Haitian migrants on board. During Laguerre, we brought several thousand migrants on board.
And you had to return them?
Well, we started it when the original time when President Aristide was ousted out of Haiti, and that was in 1991, in September. And so that was when we started mass migration issues, and we had a bunch of migrants. We had about 350 on board, and all of the Coast Guard cutters had at least that number on board, the larger ones, and we were all anchored or tied up in Guantanamo Bay, Cuba, until they were able to build a camp and a housing facility for them to bring them ashore. And that was the first mass migration we had. We've had several since.
Can you describe how the conditions of, like, maybe their travel, or how?
Well, it's a terrible situation. There's like the worst was about a 45-foot boat that we took 220 people off of.
Oh my God.
Really, really horrible situation. People were like layered in this boat. The Haitian people, they were very, very gracious people. They just wanted to come to America to make a better life for their families. And so this was one of the mass migrations. And it's really difficult getting them off, for one. The conditions are so bad on there. They definitely, most of them at that time, wanted to get off. So we would get them off. We had methods where we would put 2 boats alongside on either side, so they didn't all run to one side of the ship, because we also, not on the ships I was on, but previous ships had capsizings because of that, and a lot of them don't know how to swim, so we would lose people that way. But our objective was to get them all safely on board. So I was very fortunate. The ships I was on, we'd get them aboard. Difficult because once they got on board, there was if you were ashore at the time, there were a lot of political issues with whether to take them ashore, put them in Cuba, bring them back to Haiti. What could we do? Should we do with them? So we
feel torn yourself personally.
Felt terrible. The first night I had a bunch on board. I had like 200 on board, and I remember in my nice cozy stateroom. And they were back on the flight deck, and we did our best. We gave them an army blanket on a flight deck with non-skid, gave them a blanket, and we would feed them beans and rice. But we didn't have initially we didn't have any way to help them. And I remember a big storm came in, and I was hearing the weather hit my window, my porthole, and I just cried because I said, what can I do to help these people? I feel so horrible. They're back there. We extended the helo hanger, tried to get them all underneath the hanger. You can't fit them all in there. Well, that next day, I got the boatmates together and I said, we're building something. And so they gathered up, and I said, I need your ideas. And we gathered up all the extra canvas and whatever we had, and they sewed together a tarp for them at the time, just to protect them from the sun during the day and the weather at night. So, but that was in the early stages. Since then, the Coast Guard's come a long way with that. We have life rafts to throw over when there's problems, plenty of life jackets. We have all gone out, and all the cutters had, actually had formal tarps made to fit with poles and the whole thing. So, and we've gotten smarter on the meals that we can feed them. So we've gotten much better on accommodating them. It's still not a good situation, but that was my experience when there was primarily migrant interdiction and and law enforcement.
Now, is there anything else about the Northland that I'm missing?
No, that was a good experience for me. And then that prepared me for the command, which was my ultimate goal, was to command the 378, which was a ship I was as an ensign. I was on, that was at Boutwell.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
And I really enjoyed that tour. My very last trip, on my very last ship, I can't have any more ships, I'm too senior. We had three drug busts. We had 2 cocaine and 1 marijuana, and we brought over 6 tons of cocaine ashore and 1.5 tons of marijuana.
Can you can you tell me about the circumstances of that day, maybe as just an anecdote or aside, just so we can have an idea of what something like that is like?
The drug bust?
Yeah.
Yes, very exciting. We deployed with a prototype of the airborne use of force policy, which is now a lot better developed, but they had only done it on the East Coast. I was on the West Coast and doing Eastern Pacific patrols down off of Costa Rica, Guatemala. That's where we operated. And I was able to carry the airborne use of force helicopter with me. What it is, it's a capability that was designed to where the Coast Guard could actually fire into these boats and stop them. The enemy, I call them, the Colombian cartels, have what we call fast boats. They take these specifically designed for smuggling cocaine, these boats that they designed. They have very powerful engines on the back, and they are designed to stick cocaine in. They have shelves to put them in and to accommodate, at that time, a little over 3 tons of cocaine in one boat. And they put a couple of guys on them, and they just take off from Colombia, and they go as fast as they can to get it up to America. And we intercepted one of those, and the airborne use of force is terrific because it allows us to, we can't catch them. They go faster than our Coast Guard cutters. So we were unable to catch them, but with this airborne use of force, a helicopter can get out there, fire into the vessel, and stop the vessel, so that the Coast Guard cutter can catch up.
Oh my gosh. So you could maybe see a boat that might be...
It would wave to us and keep going. So you know there's drugs on it. So up to the time we could have that capability, and associated with the helicopters, we also took on fast small boats, a fast small boat at the time. And that boat, really the small boat, I think had more to do with us catching them than the helicopter. Is it over?
No, go ahead.
Only one of my cutters, only one of my 3 busts I got on that trip, really they shot into to stop it. The other 2, it operated similar to any other helicopter. But associated with that boat, that helicopter, I did get a real fast boat that had an over-the-horizon capability. In other words, it could go over the horizon without me seeing them as a commanding officer, and I felt comfortable I could locate them. And out at sea, that's real important. I don't want to lose your own boat. They had a radar, they had a sophisticated GPS system, so we were able to locate them, and good radio system to keep comms with them. So what happened is a small boat intercepted 2 of those boats, and when they saw that our small boats were able to keep up with them, they pretty much surrendered, and we were able to get them.
Did you face any hostility with them?
Not during those 3. Not on those 3. Well, the only danger was in them sinking and us not getting there to save them. We are lifesavers, number 1, and then we do law enforcement, number 2. And none of us like to sink anything and lose the person. So we didn't lose anybody. And they weren't resistant to us. We were fortunate in that respect. They did try to destroy the contraband. They throw it over the side, a lot of it, and they try to sink their boats. So the boats are sinking as quick as we get there. So the small boat crews and the boarding teams do a miraculous job of getting them off and arrested before their boat goes down. And oftentimes they'll jump overboard, and then we do the rescue. And then we try to gather up at least 1 bale of cocaine for the purposes of prosecution. So we got 3 of them in one trip, and we arrived back in San Diego with flags flying, and the crew real excited, and we got some good coverage on it. And that is where a natural morale booster. And my crew was on top of the world for months after that experience.
2 minutes. Let's do a couple of wrap-up questions real quick. We did talk about your education. Maybe you could tell me first your MA and your MS and what your focus were, and then we'll wrap up real quick with a conclusion question.
Okay. I have 2 masters. One is in National Security and Strategic Studies. I got it from the Naval War College in Newport. And pretty much it was a great course that dealt with all the things you can do short of going to war. But they don't teach you to go to war at the Naval War College. They teach you what you can do before that, based on diplomacy, economic sanctions, and all the things that our government uses for avoiding war. And then the final thing is to actually go take the military and use them. Then I in the ICAF, I went to Industrial College in the Armed Forces and got a MS in National Resource Strategy, which basically you look at the influence of national resources on the world and the economies, and also in using that to maintain peace throughout the world, and how we work the national resources for that. And that was through the National Defense University, the ICAF class.
Okay. So. And in closing, real quickly, what has it all meant to you? Your service, your uniform, almost 30 years in the Coast Guard, your country, your flag.
Well, I am very patriotic. I love our country. I love what we stand for. I really love the Coast Guard. I love what the Coast Guard does, and the fact that we serve our public and serve our country. And in the job I have now, I think we serve our world to make it a better place. Sounds corny, but I believe in it all, and I think it's the greatest thing I've ever done.
Do you have any regrets?
No regrets at this point. No regrets.
And you married?
Married, and I have a 15-month-old son who I birthed myself about 15 months ago, and all went well. And he's a bustling, red-headed spirit of boost of energy for me.
How has that changed your life?
Oh, more than anything else I've ever done.
That's great.
And it's the most rewarding thing I've ever done, is have a little boy.
Wow, thank you very much for your time. You did a wonderful job today.
Oh, thanks, Kate.
I think that's it.
Okay.
Well,